Hello, my name is Kevin Short, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what I consider one of the bigger news stories yesterday that probably didn't get coverage. Most people would assume that anybody who's talking about news right now is going to be talking about Joe Biden pardoning Hunter Biden. I'm not so sure that's even really news. Most of us, I think, were expecting that. Certainly, this is not really a Hunter Biden scandal. This is another one of the scandals that for Joe Biden goes back to his time in the Senate when his brother was alleged to be involved in, shall we say, some illegal activities involved in selling access to the senator. I'm really not going to dig into that one. It's not news. About the only thing that I found unusual about that was the timing. And I don't like to center my life on politics anyway. The story I'm talking about was the sentencing of Sarah Boone, who you may know as the suitcase murderess. Sarah Boone is known because there was a video going around of her being interviewed and being shown a video of what had happened the night before or a couple of nights before when her live-in boyfriend, George Torres, actually I think his name is Jorge, but they continue to call him George for the most part, was suffocating in a suitcase, and she was taunting him on a video on her phone. Clearly she was drunk, and she was convicted not long ago. I was listening to the whole trial. And yesterday was her sentencing. And I thought from a Christian worldview there were some rather important points that should be made. I wasn't sure if Dr. Mueller was going to address them or not on the briefing, but I thought, well, if I was going to post something, it would be better to do it independently. So here goes a few things that I think for Christians, particularly the Sarah Boone case, tells us about our society and who we have become as a people. So the first thing that I found very interesting in this case is that there wasn't a strong feminist reaction making Sarah the victim of the crime rather than the perpetrator. I say this because this was her defense. Her defense was that she was abused by George Torres, and that she had feared for her life when he was in the suitcase. Allegedly, she saw a little bit of his hand coming out while he was saying he couldn't breathe, and assumed she was going to get beaten up. Now, there are some very real problems with this scenario just at the outset, but I was very surprised that I didn't see a lot of feminists jumping on the bandwagon with this particular defense. Of course, what's interesting about feminism, third and fourth wave feminism, is they're very much tied into critical theory. So feminism is not one of the areas of philosophy I've spent the most time with. But third and fourth wave feminism are a little bit different from previous generations. So the first wave of feminism, if you may or may not be aware, was basically the suffragette movement. The goal of those feminists was getting women the right to vote. The second wave largely focused on a lot of workplace issues. And in some of those areas, I think they were dead right, and in some of them, not so much. But starting in the late second wave, you start getting a lot of misandry, which is hatred of men in feminism. Third wave and fourth wave feminism, though, were very much tied into postmodernism and certain areas of continental philosophy that, quite frankly, I think should be treated as pseudo-intellectualism. And a lot of this comes into what's known as critical theory. Social critical theory, it's sometimes known by its subsets such as third wave feminism or black race critical theory or critical race theory, or in theology, sometimes liberation theology. But there are a lot of intellectual problems, right, with these social critical theories. In fact, this case, I think, actually demonstrates one of those problems, because from the standpoint of social critical theory, I could make the case that this whole story is not believed because Sarah is a woman, but I could also make the case that Sarah Boone's story itself exemplifies an anti-Hispanic bias on the basis of the same critical theory. The problem with critical theory is you can kind of make whatever case you want depending on the persons involved, unless they're a white male. A straight white male. So I was very surprised that I didn't see that ball run with more. But I still think that Sarah Boone destroys some of the narratives of feminism. Now, the reason why I say narratives is because one of the problems with critical theory and third wave feminism and discussions of the patriarchy is that these ideas are overly reductive, right? If you look at ancient societies, you can say many of them were patriarchal, and they were. Not all, but most were. Interestingly enough, by the way, the non-patriarchal societies are not necessarily less warlike than patriarchal ones. There's a lot of mythology that has been treated as fact in certain areas of feminist thought. But what's interesting when it comes to the meta-narrative side is that Sarah Boone doesn't fit the meta-narrative. She doesn't fit this overly reductive narrative, which, by the way, the reason why I say it's overly reductive, ancient societies were usually a lot more complicated than the simple patriarchal narrative that feminists spring on us. You can make that case about Athens. You can make that case about Rome, certainly during the Roman Republic. It's a little harder to make that case about the Middle East and in other time periods where men and women sort of had their own spheres, right? And it was a lot more complicated than the simple stories and the simple meta-narrative that so much of feminism today propagates in. But Sarah Boone, if we're going with the narrative, we ought to view Sarah Boone as the victim. But the evidence didn't point in that direction. So, while the defense was talking about the fact that Sarah Boone was abused, and she was, some of the evidence also indicated that Sarah Boone herself was one who abused her live-in boyfriend. Among other things, there was evidence that she had withheld some of his legal paperwork to force him to come back when he had left her. After one of their police complaints, there were videos that were shown in the rebuttal case that they were awful to hear the way he was being treated by her. So what we had here was a relationship with a lot of alcohol, and in fact, I kind of question whether Sarah Boone even remembers the night that it happened. But this was, sadly, a relationship in which two alcoholics were abusing each other. Because just as there was testimony and evidence that Jorge Torres had beaten Sarah Boone, there was some evidence that she had also abused him quite a bit. One of the most disturbing, I think, was listening to a recording of the police where they were taking him out of the house. He had been invited by her to come back, even though there was a restraining order. He was being taken by the police, and they said, "Why do you keep coming back?" and et cetera, et cetera. And he said, "It's not fair. She beats me, and you arrest me." So this relationship, I think, was a little more complicated. In fact, even from the forensic evidence, the meta-narrative would not have held up. Why? Well, everything we know about this case directly from the video doesn't necessarily back up Sarah Boone's story. When I listened to the pathologist, or the medical examiner, who was giving testimony about the wounds and the damage that Torres had taken, he was beaten up pretty badly in some places. And her comment was she had used the bat to try and keep him from getting out of the suitcase he was in. But I'm not so sure that's the way it happened. There was some evidence also of some neighbors that had heard something falling down the stairs and a big bang that night. And I think most likely Sarah beat Torres with a bell bat before he ended up in the suitcase. Now, I don't know how he ended up in there. I don't know if he got in there because he was ordered to get in there or if he'd been knocked unconscious. This is something that the prosecution only noted in their final rebuttal argument, but I don't think the evidence actually backs up Sarah Boone's story that he had crawled in during a game of hide and seek. And the only evidence we have of that game of hide and seek was Sarah Boone's testimony herself, which seems to have kind of evolved afterwards. As I said, I think it's very likely she doesn't remember the night at all. So this is one of those cases where the narrative doesn't fit. Now, I was listening to this with on Emily D. Baker's podcast, listening to her commentary. In large part, I've interested in legal cases because of the epistemological ramifications of it. Law is one of those areas because we talk about evidence, whereas a philosopher epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and the study of belief, legal actions can actually be kind of fascinating in that area. And in fact, as a Christian and as a Christian philosopher, one of the more interesting passages of scripture on epistemology actually comes from a legal setting, which was that you were not to put somebody to death simply on another person's word. You had to have at least 2 or 3 witnesses for anybody to be held accountable for a crime. And this is one of the reasons why I tend to take an evidentialist stance on many things. But anyway, I'm always interested in the facts. But Sarah Boone, the facts didn't back up the narrative. And this tells us one of the problems with the way we handle narrative. If we try to fit the facts to fit the narrative, or if we simply go with a narrative because that's what's out there, we can end up getting ourselves into some trouble intellectually. Sometimes we hear statistics quoted when these types of cases are looked at. And the argument that then gets raised is because these are the statistics, this is what we should believe about it. But in point of fact, that's the wrong way to do it. We ought to be looking at the facts in each case and then looking at the statistics in other contexts, not in context of interpreting what happened here, which is precisely the direction her lawyer took. So that kind of brings me to a second point, and it's somewhat related to feminism, but it's somewhat different. This happened in the South. This happened in Florida. And one of the interesting things about the American South is there's almost a cult of white womanhood. So I no longer support the death penalty in the United States. Not because I don't think it's just. I actually do think it's just. And in fact, based on the Noahic covenant in the Old Testament, I think it's a necessary thing for justice. That's something we'll discuss at another time. However, there are a lot of problems with the American legal system, and for me, that got started with Susan Smith. Susan Smith had claimed that her car had been stolen with her children in it, and that it was a black man who did it. This was in South Carolina. turned out that she had drowned her children largely because of issues involving her boyfriend. And Susan Smith was found guilty, but she wasn't given the death penalty, even though there was a death penalty in South Carolina, and even though this was a capital case. Why? Probably because she was a white woman, and they did not want to put a white woman to death. Now, there's been a lot of change in the South, don't get me wrong. One of the things that I think we miss in discussions of the civil rights movement is the boomer generation. A lot of people will talk about how the South was conservative before and after, but actually, before the civil rights movement, the South wasn't conservative. Most of the Dixiecrats, for example, the Dixiecrats, for some of the younger people, were a group of Democratic politicians who disagreed with desegregation because, that was sort of the party line, right? The Democratic Party was the party of segregation. But the Dixiecrats were Roosevelt-style progressives in the 60s when they ran. That's something that doesn't get discussed very often, but that's what they were. And the baby boom generation, most of the baby boomers I've met in the South, I've never heard a baby boomer from the South use some of the language about African Americans that I've heard from my grandparents' generation in terms of Southerners or Northerners as well. But that's a story for another time. But that was where I got started on opposing the American death penalty. And a few other things came up. So, the number one correlation in terms of the death penalty that death penalty cases share is that most of them had state defense, the public defender's office. And that gives me some pause because it seems like if you can afford to buy an expensive enough lawyer, you're less likely to get executed. There have been a few cases where the jury got it wrong and they weren't guilty. And I have a lot of concerns about the quality of Americans serving on juries, quite frankly. So I'm not against the death penalty in theory, but I can't support the way it's done in the U.S. for a lot of other reasons besides just what I've mentioned here. Sarah Boone got life, and I found that surprising because I figured, female murder, that she might go towards the minimum. And it was interesting, though, that her defense attorney, his whole argument seemed to be built on the stereotypes of abused women. There was an abusive relationship, and therefore she must be abused. That, of course, gets more back into my first point, but I found that aspect of the sentencing a little bit interesting. It's a bit of a change in the narrative. The third thing that I found really interesting was Sarah Boone herself. So there was some discussion of Christianity. Again, I was listening to Emily D. Baker's presentation. And her presentation, she talked about how prisoners pull out the Jesus card. And it was really interesting with Sarah because when she was speaking in her own defense, she apologized, but most of her apologies were really attacks on society, the prosecutors, social media, George Torres's family, the judge, the state, and on and on and on, playing the victim card again. And she spoke of herself as this highly Christian and spiritual woman, which really goes to show you something about the way Christianity is practiced in some parts of this country. There are a lot of people who have what I call lucky rabbit's foot Christianity. They don't really live anything like what you would consider a Christian life, but they like to have that lucky rabbit's foot around just in case. And I don't want to judge anybody's spiritual state. Please don't misunderstand me here. I can't look at anybody's heart. But I don't find the way she is responding to the prosecution, to the evidence, to the circumstances, to be indicative of anything we find in biblical Christianity. There was no admission of guilt. There was no admission of wrongdoing. She was the victim. Of course, the beginning of Christianity is that we are sinners in need of a Savior, not that we are victims in need of vindication, which was largely her attitude. And I found that to be sad. I find it sad when Christianity is so misunderstood as a cultural force, and I think this is one of the reasons why we live in a post-Christian society. Now, there are huge problems with the post-Christian society, and I am absolutely an evangelical Christian. So don't get me wrong, that is not an argument against evangelicalism, but it is an argument against this type of cultural Christian or cultural Christianity that is overly focused on symbols than on substance. And the claims that were being made in her sentencing phase yesterday were not very substantive. Again, I can't read somebody's heart. I'm not going to say she's lost. There are immature Christians. There are Christians who, they're young in Christ or what have you. And I don't want to deny this is a possibility. But at least the presentation she had of Christianity was not a very good one. So I found that to be rather interesting in this case as well. So in the end, the judge sentenced her to life in prison, which, as I understand it, I don't know much about Florida law. I'm living today in a very cold northern Kentucky. But as I understand it, that's basically life without the possibility of parole. Was that an appropriate sentence? Yes. Is it a sad sentence? Yes. It's both. The problem sometimes when it comes to crime, we talk about the perpetrators and the sentences they get, and we talk about how sad their lives are. But really, I think anything surrounding crimes are ultimately very sad. She's going to lose everything. She's going to lose custody of her child. I don't know how good that relationship is anyway, considering the alcoholism. But she's going to lose custody of her child. She's going to lose access to society. And George Torres has lost everything. And in the end, it's all very, very sad. So anyway, just a few thoughts about our society and where we're going, and perhaps a little bit of what the Sarah Boone trial kind of shows, and why I think this type of case is probably more interesting in our dynamics of a society than much of the political slop that we tend to focus more on. Anyway, my name is Kevin Short. I hope you enjoy this. I know it was perhaps a little rambly in places, but I'm kind of new at this. Thank you, and I hope you have a good day. Bye.